Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. Um, this is Jerry Ho, hosting our second episode of the GTMF Forum, Music Forum, and I'm coming to you from Houston, Texas. Please take a moment, say hi, tell us where you're coming from, where you're watching from, and please go ahead and send in your questions. I will try to get to as many questions as we can throughout the session. I'm coming to you from my office here at Rice University in Houston, Texas. It's a very cloudy, gray, stormy morning here. I don't know how it is up there in Wyoming. Probably a little bit cooler and colder than here. Here at Rice, we have been shut down now since the middle of March. So our campus has been pretty deserted. It's been very strange without the students here, and especially at a school of music where so much of our time is being together, being close to each other, and making music together. It's been very strange, and our lessons here have been sort of via Zoom. Always a little bit of distance separating us as we're sort of in this time of social distancing and staying at home. This is Tracy Adams. Good morning from New York. Hello, Tracy. Thank you for joining us. We're going to have a program today for you about Beethoven. And for our program today, we will have a little bit of a playlist to accompany that you can open up on YouTube. So if you want to put that into a separate tab on your browser, that we can go back and forth as we go through each of these videos. That would be great. Our main topic for today is Beethoven. But before leading to that, I just wanted to share a little bit about what our students are doing here, especially since they're all at home, sort of practicing, and we're not able to play together. And so there's this great video that the violas from the Shepherd School of Music have put together. And all the violas here, they take a class with one of the members of the GTMF Festival Orchestra, Joan de Hosapian. She's the associate principal viola of the Houston Symphony, and they do an orchestra excerpt class. So for this class, they go through a lot of the standard excerpts of the orchestral repertoire, and because this is how the students, they prepare for auditions for professional orchestras, which is what they're here to study for. So it's a really funny, charming little video where they sort of string together a lot of excerpts that they've been working on. It's sort of a tribute to Joan, who is a much beloved teacher and friend and colleague here. So click on the playlist and just have a look, sort of as an idea of how music making is going on in this time of separation. So anyway, that gives you a little bit of an idea. If you want to watch the rest of it, please feel free to go back to the playlist after we finish up this morning. But that gives you an idea of how our students are, still trying to play together in this moment. And if you don't know how they sort of do that, they will create a sort of a click track. So they'll wear an earpiece and it has the metronome marking going through the music, and they will listen to it and they'll record their own videos on their phone or such, and then they'll sort of put it together. And that's sort of a project I've been working on with our students here at the Shepherd School. Last Friday, we were supposed to have our last concert of the semester. And one of the pieces that we were supposed to do was the Firebird Suite. And so I'm working on putting together a video of that. We have 84 videos to sort of stitch together. And so that's sort of occupying a lot of my time outside of being at home with my son, Remy. Lisa Barber is here. We're trying to do the same thing at Star Valley High School. Oh, good luck, Lisa. It's really, really time-consuming and difficult, but I think the result is pretty spectacular when people can see that they're playing together. Just to sort of recap from last time, we had our first session on the GTMF Music Forum. I had a chance to sort of introduce myself, let you know a little bit more about me, and we talked a lot about conducting and sort of what conducting was and sort of nonverbal communication. And we shared a video about just showing different styles of conducting, and there were some great conductors. So we had like Bernstein, Karajan, I believe. Who else was there? Laura Mazel and maybe Maris Janssens. And so some people wanted to see about a video of me conducting. So I wanted just to share, if you look on your playlist, to see what it looks like when I'm conducting, go to the second video on the list. You'll see a video of me conducting. Just take a minute or less. It's a video from a few years ago. So enjoy. So anyway, that was a little bit of me conducting. That was actually from my my graduation recital from the Eastman School of Music, so a few years ago. Let's see. Please let us know if you're watching, where you're watching from. Ken Avery is joining us. He's a timpanist at the Jacksonville Symphony Orchestra and a timpanist at the GTMF Orchestra. Great to see you here, Ken. Thanks for joining. Yeah, watching yourself conduct, it's sort of like hearing your own voice. It's sort of like, do I look like that or do I sound like that? So it's always not the most fun thing to do, but it's definitely a necessary thing. It's sort of like listening to yourself practice. It's definitely a way to improve, to really hear or watch what you're doing. So I just wanted to see if there's any last week. Please send in your questions. We talked about conducting. Any questions? Conductors or nonverbal communication. Charlie Doremus is in from Sweden. Good to see you, Charlie. Anything that you have, and just go ahead and type your question in, and we'll answer them as we see them come up. What you saw in that little clip was from the last movement of Brahms' First Symphony, and it was a symphony that took him more than 20 years to write. And one of the reasons that it took him so long to write was that he felt such enormous amount of pressure following the footsteps of Beethoven, who is our subject today. For me, my relationship with Beethoven, I first came to Beethoven, I randomly bought a CD, and it was an old CD from CBS. It was Bruno Walter, and it was great performances. And it was the Beethoven Pastoral Symphony, the Sixth Symphony. And I just remember hearing this, and I would fall asleep at night listening to this CD. And this was probably in middle school. And I just remember just how beautiful the music was and sort of the emotions they elicited. And then I remember later on the old classic Disney film Fantasia, sort of watching there's a great segment with unicorns and Bacchus and just nature, and then the flying horses, the Pegasus. And I just remembered it was a wonderful depiction of the music from Beethoven. And my second association with Beethoven was actually in high school. After my high school, I finally went to my first symphony orchestra concert, and it was in Chicago. Actually, it was the Chicago Symphony Orchestra, and they finished the concert with Beethoven's Fifth Symphony, and so it was quite a thrill to this piece that we all know from the very opening in those, the ba 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 bum. But to hear that live and hearing the sort of journey from darkness to light, the sort of valediction of the piece. I'm opening up a little question here. Just let us know what your favorite piece is by Beethoven, what you have heard. And let's see who else is watching here. We have Shelley from Victor. Hi, Shelley. Kay from Driggs. Wonderful to have you join us, Kay. Why Beethoven? This is a big year for Beethoven. We're celebrating the 250th anniversary of his birth. And so I thought I'd talk a little bit about Beethoven. I mean, we could spend, instead of 30 minutes, we could spend 30 hours or 30 days talking about Beethoven, sort of what an impact he has made on music. He was a revolutionary. He took us from the classical era at the end of the 1700s and took us into the new century, 1800s, changing the role of the composer in music, as well as the role of the symphony, of music itself, launching us in a new direction of what music was going to be expressing. He was born in 1770 in a town of Bonn, Germany, so sort of to the northwest area of Germany. He was very talented as a musician. So his father was determined to make Beethoven the next Mozart. Well, of course, there's only one Mozart, and every composer, every person has their own way. And Beethoven went through quite harsh instruction during his early years. And so it was at the age of 21, he finally was able to leave Bonn, and he went to Vienna to sort of set his fortunes as a musician. So at that time, Vienna was the capital and of classical music. And so he went there. This is in 1792, and he went to study with Haydn, amongst others. And he quickly became known as a piano virtuoso. And so he was giving a lot of public concerts, and he would often do these piano duels. So what is a piano duel? He would often be at a sort of salon, which is sort of a private concert that rich people would have, and they would play for in a very intimate setting. And in these duels, people would often improvise. So basically, they would just sit there and come up on the spot with melodies, and they would often do something like a theme and variations, and sort of it showed the musical creativity as well as their capabilities on the piano. And so it was definitely how Beethoven established himself as a performer. So this was and at the same time, he was still studying composition and was beginning to churn out his early musical compositions. So one thing about Beethoven, that sort of, as he took us from the classical era into the Romantic era, is his role as a composer. So before, with Haydn, Mozart, composers used to work for a court. So they would be under the employment of some sort of nobility, whether it was a duke, an archduke, or someone associated with a church, a king, and they would be a salaried employee. So their job was to write music for whether it was a party or for entertainment on a weekly basis. This was sort of how composers had lived up until this time. Well, now, in this sort of new era, they were not the employee of anyone, so they worked for themselves. And they would basically give concerts and teach. And then as the idea of publishing became more prominent, they would publish their compositions, and so the royalties that they gained from their publications. So, we have any questions so far about Beethoven? We have more people joining us. Let's see, Julie from Tetonia and Jennifer from Casper. Hi, Jennifer. Good to see you here. Sandy from Birmingham, Michigan. So a lot of people from all over. Scott Faulkner from Reno. Hello, Scott. Thank you for joining us. Please leave your questions or thoughts or comments. And we still have, what's your favorite piece by Beethoven? So please let us know. Beethoven was already establishing himself as a performer, and in 1800, put together a concert that was to sort of establish himself as a composer more than a performer. So it was April 2nd of 1800 in the Burgtheater in Vienna. And he rented out the theater, and he put on a concert that included works by Mozart, by Haydn, but also included his septet. There's a piano concerto of his that he played, of course, and then his first symphony. And so at this time, composers were sort of more responsible for a lot of and sort of promoting themselves. This is how they sort of got their name known. And as people knew more about composers, they tried to they would commission works from them, and that's how the composers would earn money as well from composition. So by the end of 1800, Beethoven was very much in demand as a composer from patrons and from publishers. And we're going to take a look at Beethoven's First Symphony here. And he was very much coming from his mentors and from his idols, Mozart and Haydn. And it's very much in the style of these classical symphonies, but it's already showing his own style, his own flavor. And it's as we watch, the symphony becomes a larger and larger artistic statement for the composer. And so I would like you just to take a second now and go to your place and listen to the 2 minutes of the Beethoven First Symphony, please. So you should be somewhere in the exposition of the symphony as I interrupt you. As I mentioned before, this playlist will stay up so you can have a chance to go back and listen to the rest of the piece, which we hope you will do. Just want to greet some more people. Meg, hi Meg, good to see you. Thanks for watching from Memphis. Talking about Beethoven's metronome markings. For musicians, it's a big topic of conversation because the metronome, when Beethoven wrote this piece, had not been invented yet. So the metronome came up in the 1812, 1814, around that time. And so the compositions, they would only have basically these Italian markings, adagio, allegro, andante, to sort of describe the idea of tempo, how fast a piece of music should go. And so it was later in 1817 that Beethoven went back to a lot of his earlier pieces, to his symphonies, and he would apply metronome markings to them. And some of these metronome markings, there's been a Beethoven at these metronome markings, and sometimes they're very, very fast. And at the time in 1817, Beethoven was, of course, something that we're going to talk about next is sort of his deafness. So he was already suffering from quite a bit of deafness. He was not completely deaf yet, but it was he really couldn't hear. But it was sort of with these tempi, these fast tempi, you sort of see how someone can imagine them to sound this fast. But it was almost some of the tempos are almost impossible to play. So there's always a debate about whether we should play completely, follow these tempo markings strictly, or whether we should sort of take them with a grain of salt. Some people will say Beethoven's metronome didn't function correctly, or he read it incorrectly. There's a lot of debate about it. What the truth is, it's hard to know, and definitely creates for very lively and zippy performances when you try to follow the methods. I feel like one of the practices of this time, and something that I learned from reading a lot of the writings of this Austrian conductor, Nicholas Hallencourt, and he does a lot of research about it and about performance practice. And time was sort of the idea that a tempo marking sort of only applies for the very beginning of a section. And the sort of the idea of there's a lot of tempo flexibility, and that the composers never really wanted a piece to just go at like a metronome with one tempo, but sort of had different speeds and different for the different ideas and different themes within the symphony. So that's definitely something I ascribe to. But I think very convincing cases have been made on CD and recording, and you can definitely check it out this summer. If you come to Jackson to hear, we'll be definitely celebrating Beethoven this summer, performances of his piano concerti, the Third Symphony, as well as some of his overtures. What I was just mentioning before was sort of, as you listen to this symphony, you hear the very start of the piece. If you know the piece, it doesn't sound very remarkable. Is that it starts on a dissonance, which is something that was counter to everything that was happening at that point. The sort of the start of a piece with a dissonance. What does that mean? It's sort of the sort of point of tension, and then it resolves. So the piece is in C major, and a lot of symphonies, when you hear it's in C major, you try to establish the tonality of piece right at the beginning. So you play a lot of C major so that we know that this is a piece in C major, and Beethoven starts us on takes C major, makes a dissonance with a sort of a dominant chord, and it's not until almost the beginning of the exposition, after the slow introduction, that we really start hearing C major being set. So already Beethoven is imposing his sort of personality and his sort of imagination, creativity, and this is what's going to sort of be a giant for a symphonic form. After finishing the symphony and his second symphony, which shortly thereafter, beginning of 1802, Beethoven was already feeling the effects of deafness. So we associate deafness with Beethoven. Sort of later on in his life, he was really hard of hearing. But it was already, even at this time, at the age of 30, he was already feeling the effects of deafness. And of his doctors, he went to the small town outside of Vienna called Heiligenstadt. It was believed then that being in the baths would sort of cure his deafness, or at least slow the progression. I mean, it was at this point already that Beethoven could feel it getting worse. And he was in quite a bit of despair. I mean, imagine he was determined to be the greatest composer since Mozart, the heir to Mozart. But he was handicapped by deafness. How can you be a composer and not hear? I mean, would anyone take you seriously? And so in this sort of moment of despair, he wrote what was sort of to become called the Heiligenstadt Testament. It was a very famous letter. So he wrote it to his brothers, and it sharing his thoughts about taking his own life because of this deafness. But it was sort of his passion, his love for the art of music, and his belief that he has so much more to offer that kept him from taking his own life. This letter was never sent to his brothers. In fact, it was only found after his death amongst his papers. So it was sort of, but it gives us a sort of insight into his mindset, his frame of mind during this time. And after he had a 6-month stint in Heiligenstadt, and then he returned to Vienna. And it was at this time that he made a big change in his musical style. So the hearing loss really impacted his ability to compose, but it really started to be a detriment to his life as a performer, as a pianist, playing own concerti. And of course, at that time, it was still a source of income for Beethoven. So it really did push him to sort of depend more on composition. As the Symphony No. 3, the Eroica, and it was written in 1803 and 1804. So this was a piece that's going to be featured in the opening concerts of the GTMF this summer, and paired along with else. And what makes this piece sort of a marker of the shift to the Romantic period, a part of it is sort of the much longer, larger scope. So it clocks in about 55 minutes. So this makes it almost twice as long as the symphony, and that's, which makes it twice as long as a lot of the previous symphonies that we've seen, the works of Mozart, works of Haydn. And have a listen to this piece. I would just like you just to take a minute now to listen to this is the last piece on our playlist for today, the minute and a half of the Heroic and Symphonies. All right, so what did you think of that? Can you hear any difference between this symphony and the first symphony which we listened to just a little while ago? Perhaps one thing that you notice is that there's no introduction to at all to the beginning. So in the first symphony, there is very much a tradition of a slow introduction, and then we go into the exposition with sort of faster music. Here we start with big E-flat chords, and it sounds like the piece has already been in motion, and we're just joining midstream. And so this is definitely something that you can see as some influence from Mozart, his G minor symphony number 40 and his C major symphony, the Jupiter 41, start very much the same way. And but the sort of what this piece interesting is, you will have to listen to the whole thing, is sort of the scope of it. So the first movement is just so much longer than the first movement of any sort of, there's a lot of symphonies that have been written in the classical era that was the same length as this first movement. So 18 minutes. And so the sections are much longer, and one of the big sections of this piece is sort of the coda, which means tail, or the ending of this first movement. And it's he introduces some new music, some new themes that these were things that were completely against the rules of what had been set up by Mozart and Haydn. So definitely Beethoven breaking into new ground. And then if you look into the second, third, and fourth movements, there's a funeral march in the second movement. And the third movement, definitely now, what used to be the tradition of the third movement was a minuet, very much from the dance forms from the 1700s, 1700s. Beethoven, even with his first symphony, shifted us now to what is going to standard for the symphony, which is a scherzo, which is a much faster, livelier style of music. In the finale, the last movement, he has a sort of a very grand theme and variations. So this definitely, the scope of the music is much, much greater. He introduces a few other things. He adds a third horn to the piece. And so between the length and the instrumentation, the style, and the last thing is the program. Symphonies, quartets, a lot of absolute music, meaning that it was music for the sake of music. Now, Beethoven is starting to ascribe associations, meanings, stories to this music, and that would play a very large role in the Romantic era that would take us through the end of the 1900s. Napoleon was very much coming out of the ideas of the French Revolution, the idea of liberty, equality, and brotherhood. And while Beethoven was writing this piece, Napoleon had decided to crown himself as emperor of France. And so in his anger, Beethoven sort of scratched out the dedication, the title of Bonaparte. And instead, when the music was published, it was sort of had a subtitle to celebrate the memory of a great man. And so this sort of association to extra musical ideas was something that we start seeing more and more with Beethoven. And so that's sort of one of the great stories with the Heroic and Symphony. I had question about your favorite piece by Beethoven. You can still answer that. There's another question up now of your experience with Beethoven. Any other questions you might have about Beethoven, the First Symphony, Eroica, anything else? Marta, good to see you. Please let us know what you want to talk about in the future, and we definitely talk more about Beethoven. But I just want to leave you with sort of the this final thoughts about Beethoven, about why he is still celebrated today. Why does Beethoven matter today? And I think part of it is we associate with this man who struggled so much. He was able to overcome all these struggles from his childhood, from his situation in dealing with his deafness, and to produce this great music that connects us all. And we all have had struggles. We've all had to overcome obstacles in our lives and it shows, it puts into sound this feeling of victory, this feeling of valediction. It connects us. Right now, people have all had their challenges, and they were able to overcome them throughout history, and it makes us feel a little bit less alone. At least this is for me. I'm speaking a little bit personally. This is for me, and that's something that's very, very important for me in music. Is just towards this idea of that we're not alone in all of this and this human experience. To this day, that's one reason I love going back to the Grand Teton Music Festival, going back to Jackson, is to spend time in nature. And imagine Beethoven being inspired by the same mountains, by the same forests, by the same lakes, streams that you see in Jackson. And we're all connected to those of us to each other in the past, and we will stay connected in the future. With that, I'll leave you. Thank you so much for tuning in and joining us for our second Facebook Live. Be safe, be healthy, and keep listening to music, and we will hope to bring some music to you. Thank you so much. Bye-bye.